We are all born free and equal.
No discrimination.
We are all equal before the law.
Right to democracy.
Right to education.
These are all human rights, and all have to do with our topic, equality. Everybody has heard about Martin Luther King and that black people were disadvantaged, for example, in South Africa or the USA. In this video, we will answer following questions. Which disadvantages had the black people in the USA? Were the demonstrations effective? And what changed? What are the Jim Crow laws, the Civil Rights Act, and the Voting Acts? Enjoy watching and learning about America's history. To understand the increased demonstrations for the black people's rights, we will travel about 150 years back. In 1865, President Abraham Lincoln and the Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery. This law was a first step toward recognizing the rights of the dark-skinned people, as they suffered under the slavery and were not treated as humans. A decade later, white Democrats gained power in the Southern states and introduced the Jim Crow laws to segregate black people, for example in schools, public places, restaurants, and transportation. There were even segregated toilets, but the toilets for white were better and cleaner. Another fact is that nurses could not be forced to care for black people. President Wilson, who came from the South, introduced segregation at federal workplaces. But the segregation was not the only problem. The black people could vote for local offices, but were not allowed to participate in the national or state elections. After World War II, Harry Truman cancelled Wilson's decision and desegregated the army, but this did not improve the situation a lot. In the 1950s, 18% of the whites and 56% of the blacks were below the poverty line. One reason is that the whites got better education and wages.
Furthermore, we are going to present the American civil rights activist Martin Luther King to you. He was born on the 15th of January 1929 in Atlanta and was murdered on the 4th of April 1968 in Memphis. He was against racial segregation between black and white people. Martin Luther King lived during racial segregation in the USA. In that time, black people got separated. For example, they had to visit special schools for black people, weren't allowed to drive with the same bus as white people, to visit the same restaurant, or to work at the same place as white people. Moreover, he gave an important speech on the 28th of August 1963 about racial segregation in Washington. More than 250,000 people took part in the peaceful demonstrations against racial segregation.
A famous quote of his speech, "I have a dream" is, "I have a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will be not judged by the color of the skin, but by the content of their character." In his speech, he dreamed of a world where people are equal and have the same rights no matter what skin color, and where people live in peace and justice. He wanted to make the world better for his own children.
Martin Luther King gave his last speech, "I've Been to the Mountaintop," on the 3rd of April 1968, one day before he was shot on his balcony at the Lorraine Motel on the 4th of April 1968 at around about 6 p.m. in Memphis. As a consequence of his death, many demonstrations were held and a lot of people were arrested because of their will against inequality. Nowadays, Martin Luther King is remembered as a hero against racial segregation. Martin Luther King's commitment to fighting for the black people's rights was effective. John F. Kennedy introduced the Civil Rights Act on the 11th of June 1963, but it did not get enough votes to come into force. But 1 year later, his successor Lyndon B. Johnson signed the law, as 70% of the Congress agreed. Now we are going to Washington, D.C. to listen to President Johnson's speech.
My fellow Americans, I am about to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Its purpose is national, not regional. Its purpose is to promote a more abiding commitment to freedom, a more constant pursuit of justice, and a deeper respect for human dignity.
Its purpose is the prohibition of discrimination based on race, religion, and color. By the way, Kennedy appointed the first black man working for the Secret Service. Furthermore, the Attorney General, at this time Robert F. Kennedy, can take legal proceedings against members of the government who operate a segregation at school or in public places. There were many cases where governors, for example of Alabama and Mississippi, did not accept black students at a university. What the law did not include was a protection against police brutality and ending the discrimination in private employment.
1 year later, President Johnson has passed the next law, the Voting Acts of 1965, which secured the right that racial minorities can take part in the local, state, and national elections. Trump comes some years later.
What about the current situation? Martin Luther King's and the civil rights movement's activity contributed to less racism and no segregation, and especially President Kennedy and Johnson supported the black people. In 2008, the first Afro-American president, Barack Obama, was elected. But we still hear about black people shot by police officers, although they were innocent. As a reaction, more whites demonstrated against racial inequality with slogans like Black Lives Matter.
Thanks for your attention!